Hello, it's James here. Sorry to interrupt today's episode of Frontline. We'll be right back in just a moment. But I wanted to tell you about a very exciting new channel. It's called History Undone. With me, James Hansen, and if you love Frontline, I have a feeling you're going to absolutely love this. Each episode, we go back to an iconic moment in history and replay it. In other words, asking ourselves what the long-term consequences would have been had certain key factors played out differently. For the first episode, we are rewinding the clock 80 years to the 6th of June, 1944, Operation Overlord, D-Day, and in particular, the landing on Omaha Beach. We're going to put a link to the channel in the description of this video. Please do like, share, and subscribe, and join us for History Undone.
That defeat of Russia, which is already very costly, 500,000 casualties according to the British MOD on the Russian side. That defeat is important because without that defeat, our security will be less than it is today.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by Ivo Daalder, US Ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Ambassador Daalder was also a Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution and was Director for European Affairs on President Bill Clinton's National Security Council. He's now CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, author of many books, and has his own weekly podcast, World Review with Ivo Daalder. Ivo Daalder, welcome to Frontline. Great to see you. Let's start with President Biden's comments to Time magazine over Ukraine joining NATO. And he said, "I am not prepared to support the NATOization of Ukraine." And then he also said, "Peace doesn't mean NATO." What's your reaction to that?
Well, the President Biden has made very clear that this is not the time for Ukraine to be brought into NATO. There's an active war going on. If Ukraine were to join NATO today, that would mean under the collective security agreement and commitment that is inherent in the treaty, in Article 5 of the treaty, that NATO will be at war with Russia. And one of the guideposts that President Biden has laid down, but frankly all of NATO governments have laid down, is we will support Ukraine in every way we can, except directly getting involved in the war. So I think that is first and foremost a message that he has made, I know, privately to President Zelensky and publicly, that this is not the time for Ukraine to join NATO. I do believe, however, that ultimately this conflict will not end until there is an understanding that Ukraine is safe and secure from Russian aggression. And the best way to do that, we have found over the last 75 years, is to be a member of a military alliance like NATO. The more secure Ukraine is, which it would be as a member of NATO, the less likely it is that Russia will be a threat to Ukraine. And in the long term, the President Biden and indeed all NATO leaders have agreed that not only that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but also that its future is in NATO. That's not going to change, and I don't think that will. He implied or sought to imply that that wasn't going to be the case.
So, for President Zelensky, membership of NATO can't come soon enough. When Biden says peace doesn't mean NATO, I mean, it's being interpreted in different ways. One, that he's saying, okay, it's not coming anytime soon, or that a peace deal ceding territory to Russia, thereby freezing the conflict, is no longer a way to become a member of NATO. That is off the table. How do you see it?
Yeah, so I don't quite know. I mean, I wasn't there, and the president, I haven't talked to him about this in these details for, well, not since he was a vice president. You know, he is someone who believes that if you're going to be a member of NATO, then you need to be willing to defend that country. And right now, given the situation that exists, the United States has made very clear, and all NATO members have made very clear, that they're not prepared to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. They're prepared to do everything short of that: provide arms, provide intelligence, provide training, provide support for a long-term capability of the Ukrainians to defend themselves and after a war to deter a Russian attack, but not at the moment to get directly involved. I think that's really what he's saying. The question of how peace or an end of the war will come about is something that the administration and President Biden himself has said is for the Ukrainians to decide. It's not for us to decide. Personally, I believe that you won't get to an end of the war, an end of a true peace, without Ukraine feeling secure, which is something that it can only do by being a part of NATO, and therefore tell the Russians that further military aggression just won't pay. We're not there yet.
How do you make Russia understand that further military aggression just won't pay?
Well, for now, by doing everything we can to support Ukraine in its ability to defend itself, and when I say everything, I mean everything short of a direct military engagement by U.S. and NATO forces. I was glad to see that President Biden has now finally allowed Ukraine to defend itself by targeting Russian forces that are directly attacking Ukraine from their territory. I would like to extend that to any military target that is directly or even indirectly related to Russia's capacity to continue its aggression against Ukraine. I do think that we should raise the priority, generally speaking, in terms of what kind of weapons and capabilities we have and should be shipping to Ukraine. I note that when Israel was attacked in the largest missile attack and drone attack any country has suffered in a single day from Iran, that the United States and Britain and France and indeed Jordan actively helped to defend Israel against that attack. I would like to see that capability sent to the Ukrainians. They have lost half of their power generating capacity, in part because they don't have enough air defense systems to defend their cities and their power generation capacity. So there's more we can do. We've done an awful lot. No country has received as much weapons and as much intelligence and as much training from NATO countries led by the United States, but Britain and Germany and others as well. But I think we can still do more. The Germans could send long-range missiles. The Taurus missile, we could spend more long-range missiles and air defense systems. And I think that's where we need to go, because that will convince Russia that it can't outweigh either the Ukrainians or the United States or NATO. And at that point, the Russians will have to rethink what they're all about.
And in terms of what is at stake here, President Biden did say the West has a duty to defend Kyiv from falling to Russia, as it would quickly see Poland and other bordering nations go down too, he said. But Putin came back and said he made this rare appearance before foreign journalists. And he dismissed imperialist ambitions and the idea of attacking NATO. Why would he say that now?
Well, he's trying to prevent and deter the United States and NATO allies from continuing to provide assistance to Ukraine. He's trying to tell them, you do that, you may risk a war with Russia, and no one wants that. So just as we are trying to help Ukraine defend itself and ultimately deter Russia from continuing the fight, Russia is trying to do the same thing. I do note, however, that the president on D-Day in Normandy made probably the strongest case yet of the importance of Ukraine to global security, and not just making sure that Ukraine, which is defending freedom against the kind of domination that we saw and we're fighting against in World War II, that victory in World War II is now at stake because the Russians are on the march in Ukraine. He's made that commitment, and I think that's the right commitment to make sure that Ukraine ultimately can control its own future and does control its own future. It's less about territory, this war. It's about Russian willingness to accept that it has a neighbor with the freedom to decide for itself and its own future. Russia hasn't been willing to do that. It's time it does.
You were US ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013 when Dmitry Medvedev was president in a brief swap with Putin. What were Russia's relations like with NATO at that time?
Well, they were improving. Of course, it did come after the Georgia invasion in 2008, which happened before I was there. There was a big debate within NATO to see if we could continue to do business as usual with Russia. We decided that the answer to that was no, but that if there was an opportunity to create a better and more amenable strategic partnership or a relationship with Russia, we should try. And clearly, at the time, contrary to the kind of language we now hear from Mr. Medvedev, there was a willingness by Russia to seriously consider doing that. And we had an intensive dialogue with the Russians to find ways in which we could cooperate. And Russia was very, very critically important, for example, in allowing the West and the United States and others to ship military capabilities to Afghanistan in order to continue our war there. Lots of equipment was traveling through Russian airspace and Russian railroads in order to get to Afghanistan, a landlocked country that otherwise you'd have to go through Pakistan. Which was hard and difficult. So there were many ways in which we were cooperating, and Medvedev seemed to be genuinely interested in doing so. Of course, it turned out as some were fearing at the time, and what became pretty evident afterwards, that the real master behind the scene remained Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin certainly had no particular interest in having a cooperative relationship with NATO.
And you seemed quite optimistic after the third ever summit of the NATO-Russia Council, when NATO was on this path of a strategic partnership with Russia. You met to review 21st century security challenges, agreed on a program to deal with them. So you think the understanding was genuine at the time?
I don't know whether it was genuine or not. I mean, people history will tell, but it certainly we were attempting to find a way. The Obama administration was engaged in a reset, as we called it, to try to find a new way of engaging Russia on the kinds of issues that were of common concern. Terrorism being one of them, stability in Afghanistan being another, non-proliferation being a particular big issue. We had concluded a large, important nuclear arms control agreement, the one that is set to expire in about 18 months' time. The last one left. So we had a cooperative relationship, and we were working to see if we could develop ballistic missile defenses together in order to defend against the kind of threat that Israel now faces from Iran. We had relationships with President Medvedev. I had a relationship with Dmitry Rogozin, who was the Russian ambassador to NATO at the time, a nationalist, but someone who seemed at times to be willing to find ways to cooperate. Were we naive? Probably. Certainly our Polish and Baltic friends were constantly hammering away and saying, you can't trust these guys. They turned out to be right. And for those of us who tried to find out if there was a relationship, it still was worth trying. But in the end, it didn't work. And here is where we are.
And what did you think of Dmitry Medvedev? Because you met him, didn't you, on several occasions?
Yeah, I did meet him. He was at the NATO summit in Lisbon, which is probably the most positive summit we had with the Russians in a very long time. Certainly the last time we had a positive one with them. In 2012, the Russians didn't show up. Putin was already president at that time. Again, president, as I said. And I met him in Sochi. The North Atlantic Council traveled to Sochi and met with him at the presidential dacha there. He seemed to be genuinely interested in the cooperative relationship and trying to figure out ways in which we could move forward. I met with Foreign Minister Lavrov many times, and we had the relationship in which we had a list of grievances and they had a list of grievances, and we tried to go through them and tick them off and see how we could resolve them. We resolved some. We didn't resolve all of them. But in the end, Vladimir Putin, when he came back in 2012, after the large-scale protests that had occurred in Russia surrounding both his re-election and then the parliamentary elections afterwards, had changed, and he clearly was moving towards a sense that we could not have a relationship with NATO, that NATO was the enemy, that NATO was imposing its own desires on countries that where Russia thought it needed to have its say, what it calls it near abroad, and we've seen the consequences since 2014, and when the war against Ukraine really started. This war's now been going on for over 10 years. We've been living with the consequences.
When Donald Trump effectively invited Putin to do whatever he liked to alliance members who didn't pay up, as he put it, in other words, not spending 2% of GDP on defence, how much damage do you think it did to NATO? And what kind of opportunities do you think that kind of comment presented to Putin?
I think it did extraordinary damage. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which each year is sort of call it the Academy Awards for Global National Security wonks in Munich. Shortly after Donald Trump had made those remarks, and at the same time, it was also a time where Navalny was found dead in his prison, and the Russians had taken a critical town in the Donetsk area. And the mood among Europeans, among allies, was that they were squeezed between Trump and Putin. Trump, that is a country that, in the United States, should he come back as president, could no longer be relied on as it had been since 1941, when you think about it, as a country that cared about European security, and Putin, because he was willing to do whatever it takes for him not only to stay in power and eliminate his opposition, but also to extend Russia's territorial and ideological ambitions as far beyond its borders as it possibly could. So it did great damage, and it has raised fundamental questions among Europeans, both at official levels and I'd say even more among publics, about, can we trust the United States? Will the United States be there when it matters? And alliances are based on trust. They're not based just on capabilities. They're certainly not based on dollars and cents. They're based on the idea that if I do my part, that others will be there when it matters. I mean, Estonia and other countries sent most of their military to Afghanistan, not because they thought there was a threat from Afghanistan, but because they wanted to be good allies. And they did that because they want the United States to be a good ally in return. And that is what Donald Trump, in making these really outrageous statements that suggest that our commitment to security in countries depends on how many dollars and cents they spend, is calling into question. That in the 75th anniversary year of NATO.
What do you think is the greatest threat to NATO, to the alliance? Is it Putin or Donald Trump if he ever becomes president?
Well, it's Putin because he has aggressive ambitions to divide NATO so that he can extend his influence and control further beyond his borders, not just Ukraine, not just Belarus, but the Baltic states, Poland. Who knows where it will end? So it is that drive, this aggressive imperialist drive that is at the core now of Russia's foreign policy. That is the threat. The problem is that Donald Trump is undermining the best instrument we have for dealing with that threat, and in fact making sure that it doesn't come about, because he's undermining the one thing that the United States and its allies have that the Russians, and by the way, the Chinese don't have, and that is a faith in alliances, the idea that alliances make us more secure, not because they are paying us, not because they're spending money on defense, but because we have common interests to come together and defend those interests together. So ultimately, without Putin, you don't worry as much about the strength and unity of NATO. But given that we have Putin, Donald Trump's questioning of alliances writ large, not just in Europe, but also in East Asia, is undermining American security, American prosperity, and ultimately American freedom. And that is what, in some ways, this election is about, but also what this debate is about how to think about our engagement and continued engagement in the world.
The NATO 75th anniversary summit is fast approaching. It's next month in Washington. If you were US ambassador to NATO right now, what would you be saying and doing, and what would your priorities be at that summit?
Well, we have a terrific ambassador at NATO in Julian Smith, so I know that she's doing everything that she can possibly do to strengthen the alliance. I think there really are two things that we need to focus on. One is to continue the implementation of strengthening deterrence and defense capabilities of a now enlarged NATO that includes Finland and Sweden, to make sure that NATO will always be there to defend every inch of NATO territory against the aggression, both military and in terms of hybrid capabilities that the Russians continue to focus on NATO and NATO territory. That's number one. I'm very confident that we will continue to do that. The spending is going up because Europeans understand there is a real threat. It's not because the United States tells them to. It's because they actually think it's important for their own security to do it. Thank you, Mr. Putin. Is the one thing that you can thank him for. And the second thing is really to make sure that there is a complete and utter unity on the question that Ukraine cannot fail. That Russia cannot succeed in Ukraine, that we do whatever it is that we need to do in order to ensure that Ukraine succeeds. Success doesn't necessarily mean the reconquering of every inch of Ukrainian territory that the Russians have occupied either since 2022 or indeed since 2014. That's really for the Ukrainians to decide. But it is to make sure that Ukraine succeeds as a state in which it can determine its own future, including its future to be a member of NATO and the European Union, should it so desire, and should the allies agree, as I think they should and will, but also to be able to control their destiny in without fear or favor to an aggressive neighbor, and that defeat of Russia, which is already very costly, 500,000 casualties, according to the British MOD on the Russian side. To that defeat is important because without that defeat, our security will be less than it is today.
The next Secretary General is expected to be confirmed in Washington next month. Your fellow countryman, Mark Rutte, what will he bring to NATO and to Ukraine?
Well, he's the most senior European statesperson around. He's been in power for 13 years. He is an extraordinary consensus builder. You have to be in order to be in Dutch politics, certainly to be as successful as he has been. Four different coalitions, 4 different governments with a wide variety of political parties. He's well known within the European Union as a consensus builder, as someone who brings coalitions together. And that is the core of what a NATO Secretary General does. A NATO Secretary General is far less general and far more secretary. That is to say, the person has no vote. All it has is the power of persuasion and the leadership that comes with the power of persuasion. And Mark Rutte is singularly capable of doing that and has demonstrated in the EU he will do it. Having the most senior European statesman to be the Secretary General of NATO, particularly someone who is a genuinely nice person and willing to work with anyone at any time, is particularly useful at this time. So they're still dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the consensus. There's still some issues to be overcome, but I expect that NATO will in October have a new Secretary General, and it will be Mark Rutte, and I think the alliance will be the better for it.
Ivo Daalder, a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.